Okay, I see the numbers rising. Hi, hello everybody. Happy Wednesday. I see a lot of people trickling in. Thanks so much for joining us. While you guys are getting settled, I'm going to launch a poll and then I'll do some intros. I'm Amanda. I'm your host for today. Here's the poll for just curiosity while we're waiting. What prompted you guys to join? We're excited to find out why. Are you here for education? Are you here for project research? Are you a massive fan of Nasser or potentially Mike Yappy? But we'll get to know everyone.
Don't bet against that. Don't bet against that.
Are you a prevalent customer? Are you lost? It's fine. You'll learn something. Anywho, a couple of housekeepings before I do my spiel here. Everyone's muted, you guys. So while we want you to participate, we won't be able to hear you. So use the Q&A, use the chat, raise your hand, whatever it is you want to do, just to keep us engaged. Want to keep you on your toes. We'll be asking a lot of questions. It'll be an interview type of webinar, so we're excited about that. And if you do have any questions, we'll try to get to them at the end of the session, so stay tuned. So as you can see here, we are talking about 5 implications for your third-party program. We have a couple of acronyms on here. We'll get to those in a second, but ABAC and ESG is our priority conversation. Our guest speaker today is Nasser Fattah. He's cybersecurity and third-party risk leader. You can read here, he's passionate about all things cybersecurity, third-party risk management, all those fun things. And we're really excited to have him on. He's a firecracker, in my opinion.
Just for the record, and I don't even get a slide. Just
literally, can you let me? Can you?
I don't even want the line on Nasser's slide, just for the record.
We're really excited to have this one on. This is Mike Yaffee. For those of you who don't know, he is the CMO here at Prevalent. We're just so excited to have him on here because he's just quite
way to peddle to the audience.
Yeah, I'm sure that's all the reason why everyone's here right now. Anywho, so we are going to talk acronyms on here. So we're going to give you a little cheat sheet here. Obviously, TPRM, we hope you know what that means. It's third-party risk management. ABAC is anti-bribery and anti-corruption. ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And CSO is chief security officer. I'd be really concerned if you didn't know what any of these mean. The middle two, I'd be okay with, but the top and bottom, you're probably clicking, what am I doing here in this poll? I'm going to end it right now. Well, that is it for me, you guys. We're going to record this session. If you ended up not paying attention to it, it's going to be in your inbox tomorrow morning. And I'm going to let Yaffee, unfortunately, take it away. Godspeed to all of you. Good luck.
Don't spoil it. I mean, oh my God. Yes, I've already seen a couple chats. We will make the slides available. They're just question and answer slides. We'll also make the recording available because that's where I think the real value is going to come from Nasser. Talking about, let's see if I could just scroll the next slide, talking about and kind of giving his answers. So we have, Nasser, how many do we end up with? Like 13, 14 slides in some areas?
Yeah, about a dozen. Yeah.
Okay. And Nasser can get, look, between the two of us, we can get off, we could do this in one slide for 48 minutes. So we're not going to try to get there, but we'll try to keep it on pace. If you have a question and it's relevant, feel free to shoot it on the chat function. We'll do our best to answer. If not, we'll answer them at the end, and we'll try to keep this, look, fun and punchy. I've been in InfoSec for 20 years, had the opportunity to meet a lot of great folks like Nasser. So why don't we dive right in? So Nasser, first question, right? Third-party risk is challenging in and of itself. I'd say a lot of people are still trying to figure it out. How do I do it? What do I do? I'm doing a spreadsheet. And, one of the things that has always driven me crazy is you hear people talking about fourth parties and they do all this other stuff. A lot of people haven't even started solving the basic tenets of third party risk. And now you're hearing about ESG and ABAC. Why should they give a you-know-what about this now? What is it? Why is it important? And what are kind of the implications?
Oh, hey, thanks for that. And thanks for having me on. Just a quick disclaimer, the opinions and views that you hear from me is from Nasser, not for those who I provide services to. So I just wanted to quickly say that. But to kind of jump into what you said, Mike, I think we all in the third-party risk management space have been very accustomed to certain types of risk where we're talking about privacy, cyber, business continuity and compliance, and now gaining a lot of momentum is ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as well as ABAC, anti-bribery and anti-corruption. And just a little bit of insight as to what is ESG, and then we'll talk about ABAC. You know, when you look at ESG, the environmental looks at, you know, what is the business doing as a steward, or is the business violating environmental risk? You know, may that be air, water pollution, deforestation, gas emission, you know, are they impacting climate changes? So that's the environmental responsibility of businesses, right? And in particular, public business gets a lot of scrutiny in that particular space. And then there's the social aspect of ESG that looks at, you know, diversity and inclusion, and are you doing fair labor management? And what is it about privacy and security? Because that also plays an aspect of social, because you're protecting your customers' information. And then the last piece is the governance, where, you know, as a public company, what are you doing about your executive page? Is your board, do they have a governance program? Do they look at ethics? Do they understand shareholder rights and things of that nature? So those three things, when they come together, is really, really important. And I'll give you an example of what would happen if something went south. So just imagine that we're doing business with a vendor, and unbeknownst to us, because we're not doing ESG due diligence on a particular vendor, this vendor is polluting local water supplies, using forced child laborers, or have terrible work conditions like sweatshops for its employees in order to deliver goods and services to our organization. You know, these conditions are not only unethical, they're unlawful. And to make a long story short, they're just bad business. And because of this, you know, when this becomes known, it can easily impact an organization's reputation, because they're dealing with a vendor that is unethical, might be breaking tons of laws, as well as, you know, you have not only a reputational impact, but you'll have investors that are all paying very close attention to ESG, as well as your partners and customers. So this is why this can really snowball into a significant challenge for an organization if they're not paying attention to ESG when it comes to their vendor portfolio. And then the other thing I would say here is, you know, regulators have really started to zone in ESG, starting with the EU, where they are requiring public companies to provide ESG disclosure statements, and as well expecting companies that are reaching out to these vendors to do business with, that they're doing ESG due diligence, as well as ABAC, which we'll talk in a second. And these regulations that is being pushed out, starting again in the EU, in the United States, there's a tremendous amount of conversation taking place. And if you've been following President Biden's conversations around climate change, that has to do with ESG. Even US regulators are paying really close attention here. And again, these violations do come with very, very, very stiff penalties when it comes to fines, as well as giving the victims, the stakeholders that might be on the opposite end of an ESG violation, the rights to take these public companies to court, right? So again, you know, organizations that have a vendor portfolio really needs to pay attention to ESG, in particular, you know, when you're looking at places in the world that unfortunately is known for bad working conditions and all types of forced child labor and things of that nature. So that's where ESG plays a significant part. And again, a lot of scrutiny from the regulators, including fines and enabling stakeholders to take them to court. And that can easily come back and bite you as an organization. Let me quickly talk.
Nasser, quick question. So yeah. It's taking assessments, if you will, and it's not just a security. It's not like you're not asking for internal security controls. You're asking for, please explain to me how you're an ethical business. And I'm not familiar with the questions, right? I don't write the questionnaires, but it's getting them to answer a different set of questions. Do you find that ABAC or ESG are run by the same third-party folks? Is it run in concert, like procurement, enterprise risk? Is there a completely different group spun up? Like, and maybe it's even too early to say this is kind of the default, who's owning this and who's running this, but just curious.
Yeah, in the current state that I've seen when I work with my peers, it has been typically compliance, and because APAC is definitely a compliance matter, and organizations, public companies in the United States have become very acclimated with ABAC. What's happening with ABAC now, which is anti-bribery, anti-corruption, is that they are extending what they do internally to their vendors now from an ABAC perspective. So ABAC has been, I would say, around longer than ESG, although ESG has been in the space for some time, but organizations in the compliance space have been paying attention to ABAC, and right now, currently, I see ESG also falling in the compliance space. And typically, if you're going to be doing ESG with your vendors, often you have an internal program that you as an organization is already establishing ESG policies on how you handle ESG matters in your organization, in your community, things of that nature is already in place so that you can extend that to vendors. I have not seen where organizations are looking at ESG with vendors and they themselves don't have an ESG program for themselves. So that's what I've seen, Mike. You know, compliance and ABAC has been there historically. ESG picking up a lot of momentum, but it really starts both of these internally with the organization, and then they start to extend that capability out to their vendor community.
So it's almost like the company themselves, and I'm just parroting it back, but you're saying the company themselves would have a program and then it would become an important enough thing to kind of proliferate and say, look, I want my ecosystem or my supply chain to share the same values. So then we're going to proliferate and kind of double check that out as we go.
That's absolutely true. You know, the way I see it is, you know, your vendors, your partners to a large extent is really an extension of your business. You know, they're doing something on behalf of your business as if they were your business. So you're absolutely right. It starts at the core internally, and then it proliferates to the vendor portfolio accordingly.
Have you seen anybody do this in terms of starting with ABAC or ESG and then kind of get to the security, or is it everybody kind of has some third-party process and then maybe it works with compliance or you work with compliance, but you're kind of getting some leverage on the policies, procedures, workflows that you already have in place? What's the sequence of events, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think that if you look at third-party programs historically, you know, it usually starts with what I like to call the big three, which is cyber, privacy, and business continuity. And that's because there's been a lot of focus in cyber, privacy, and business continuity, and rightfully so, right? I mean, if you look at what's happening with ransomware, that has a tremendous amount of cyber implication. If you look at the new cyber laws that have come out, you know, from GDPR to CCPA in California and other ones coming out, that becomes really relevant. And business continuity does not go away. Business continuity is making sure that you have operational resiliency, to make a long story short. So those things are really, really important, but they are not the only things for an organization. So this is why when you start looking at third-party risk, it becomes what I like to call a 360 view, you know, from a risk perspective, right? You know, what is it that this vendor, this engagement is providing me? And then what are those risks associated with it? And there should be risk, and not because risk is a bad thing. You know, whenever you do business, you're always going to take on some risk, right? That's no different than investing in the stock market, right?
Oh yeah, it's operational risk. You either choose to accept or deny that risk based on whatever conditions or parameters you set in place. So
yeah. So understanding that, you know, that when you're looking at vendors as your partners to provide you a business service, a business good, that vendor, because it's doing business like any other business, there are going to be some risk associated with it. So if you understand, you know, how do I look at this vendor from a risk perspective, 360 degrees, some vendors may introduce potential cyber risk, privacy risk. Now we're talking about ESG, ABAC. The more relevancy when it comes to risk that a vendor can provide, and the more due diligence you can do in a very risk-based manner, you know, not just basically by a default, I need to do ABAC on you because I'm going to do ABAC. You know, there should be some justifiable vendor characteristics, engagement characteristics that would trigger, you know, why you're doing an ABAC. So there's
it's a downstream thing, right? It's if A then B then C, right? If you fail this, don't do this, or don't do that, then you're downstream and it triggers something else, right?
Right. That's absolutely the case. And I just want to just connect the dots just to make sure that we're still on the same slide, just in case we're moving around. So
no, we're still on slide 1. That's what I was talking about. But I told you we were going to do the slides, and then I was going to ask you 10 questions anyway.
No, you can't.
About what you were talking about.
No, and you definitely can. And we should. I mean, this is pretty productive.
But that's the thing. Look, I'm just putting myself in the place of a customer, right? So or somebody who's trying to figure this out. Like, okay. So I think we get it, what it is. And folks, correct me if I'm wrong, or Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't get it. So, and Look, I think this is probably a short answer, but obviously global conditions have changed since Biden came into office. I think people are definitely focused more on corporate sustainability and responsibility. Is that why we're hearing about it now? Is that why people are trying to, or is there something else?
I think there's a few things. What you said is absolutely true. I mean, our government, our president is paying very closely attention to ESG, and because of that, rightfully so, there's a lot of attention. I also think that, as I mentioned earlier, regulators have been paying very close attention. I know in the EU, if they haven't already pushed out regulations, they're soon to, but I think they have. In the United States, our regulators are talking about how to do the same thing as in EU. So we may see ESG regulations actually coming out, although right now, regulators are pushing, public companies into providing ESG disclosures so that their stakeholders are aware of it. So you already see that momentum. And I also think it has been part of board agendas. So board are now looking at an organization, the board members are asking for, hey, when we talk about third party, what is it that we're doing with ESG? So that's come to the agenda of the board. And there's also, vendors in the market that has now provided these types of services, because ESG and ABAC is challenging within your own organization, by the way. And then when you try
to ask right there. So, and I don't even know if we have a slide on it, but so what is the biggest challenge relative? Sorry, my Zoom thing went off there. You know what, Amanda, when you said you should put your phones on silent, I totally wasn't listening to you. Apologies.
I'm shocked. That's fine.
So Nasser, what would you say are the biggest challenges around, let's say you do have a third-party process, right? You're using some, whether prevalent or something else, doesn't matter. You've got some process that's something more than a spreadsheet. You're able to get results. So you're at a, say, intermediate level with third party. When it comes to implementing ESG or ABAC, top 1, 2, 3 things people should consider, challenges, like do this or definitely don't do this, and it could be either one.
Yeah, so so I kind of go back to for starters, if you're doing ESG and ABAC with your third-party vendors, I'm going to presume you already have these programs in your organization, from policies to standards to all types of evidence collections. You're already doing this internally. So now that you're extending this to a third party, I think is really important to understand what are the appropriate triggers. When am I going to do ESG? Is it because this is a critical vendor? Is it because this vendor operates in a country that's unfortunately known for ESG violations? No different than with ABAC, right? So there are certain profiles that you would like to establish when you look at your vendors, because this is not applicable for every single vendor. As a matter of fact, that would not be conducive or efficient. But you definitely want to have what are the appropriate trigger points. And I gave you some examples such as countries and locations and things of that nature. So that would be one. And then the second thing is, I think sometimes it's very easy. I shouldn't say easy, but it's probably, it lends itself for us to quickly formulate questions. Hey, I need to ask the vendors, do they have an ESG policy? Do they have an ABAC policy? Do they support the following local laws and regulations related to ESG and ABAC and so forth? Those questions are pretty good, and you can definitely further tailor them. I think some of the challenges, the evidence. When you get something back, what does it really mean, and how do you really measure that, right? And I think there is no today a SOC 2 equivalent, as an example. So when we talk about privacy and security, we can rely on our vendor to go hire an independent party to come in and do a SOC 2, and you get to understand what controls are in place, what's effective from a privacy, cyber, et cetera. With ESG and ABAC, that's not in place yet, at least not from my understanding from a SOC 2 as an example. So you kind of have to do that as an entity. I do know that there are services out there, companies that would provide you ESG ratings, and it's important to understand how they formulate the ratings, where's that information coming from, what data they're getting. The same thing for ABAC, by the way. So sometimes if you feel that, hey, you know what, even if I were to ask these questions, can I get an independent source so I can use it as a soundboard, or even do continuous monitoring? Those services are now spinning up. They have been available in the market, and I know people are beginning to subscribe to them because they want to know about their vendors' ESG disposition as well as their ABAC.
Okay. So you had mentioned the big 3 before. We have a big 2 on this slide. We didn't put business continuity on it, but taking a step back and helping people understand, and this is obviously a big question now relative. So if ESG and ABAC are step 5 and, we're on a 10 scale and then there's advanced things, how do you architect a program? And then how do you architect a program to get there, right? So that it flows correctly into ESG and ABAC.
Yeah, so I think you definitely need to build a framework, right? You need to build a TPRM framework where you can then interconnect those risk disciplines, and you can decide based on your vendor portfolio which risk disciplines you like to onboard first. And I'm assuming that we're starting this from scratch. You have the opportunity to take a whiteboard and start putting all this together from the very beginning. And I would also add that, I'll kind of take a step back and I would say, hey, if I'm building this TPRM from scratch, what are the objectives? What are the key objectives that I want to accomplish from this TPRM program? It's just not about onboarding vendors, by the way, although that's really important because you need to be able to onboard vendor in a very safe and sound manner and as quickly as possible. That's what the business demands. But I think you have to look at objectives such as, do I want to be able to identify, report, and manage risk associated with my vendors? Do I want to introduce cost savings? Because we may have so
How do you
many
introduce cost savings? Because look, whenever everybody, we have ROI documents, and I just don't think, and explain it to me, right? But security risk is a cost center. You spend more money, it's insurance, right? At the end of the day, I'm doing this to mitigate my risk or define and accept a level of risk in case something bad happens. So how do you see this as a cost savings?
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple examples, but it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. So, to me, one of the cost savings that if you were building a program is, what redundancy do you have there? Sometimes when a TPRM program is being formulated, they may have 5 contracts with the same vendor. And that's because you have a very large organization. It's very decentralized when it comes to contracts. So you may have, you may be doing business with the same vendor, 5 different contracts. You're not taking advantage of one contract, massive discounts, and ways of introducing cost savings just from a contractual perspective, because people never realize that right across the floor, there are 2 other business units that are using the same vendor, right? So that's one. I also think that if in your portfolio, as you do your due diligence and you establish approved vendors, these are the vendors that are approved to provide these services, these goods, and they've been pre-approved already. They have a master service agreement in place. They have a rate card in place. You've already negotiated the best prices for those rate cards. And anybody now comes along and they want to use a service or product, it's nice to have a vendor list that tells them, hey, these are the people that we can go to and be able to take advantage of cost savings in that fashion. Again, that's just an example of that, right? And then if we talk about automation, if you just talk about, hey, I like to leverage technology, I like to automate a lot of these manual processes, then you can look at your labor force. Hey, how long does it take us to manually, because that's what we do today, how long does it take us to manually process this? And how much can I save on the labor hours, the administrative hours, if I were to automate this in technology? And they've shown that, technology does lend itself to that. And not only that, usually what happens in that particular scenario with technology, not only do you get cost savings, but you get scalability. Holy macro, I can do more of these more consistently with higher quality, faster, but still very sound and safe because technology is lending itself to it. So there's definitely ways of concretely showing cost savings. It's just a matter of how you're collecting those data and then how you present it from a cost saving perspective. But again, that can be an objective of your TPRM program, right? And
look, I think that's the most important thing that you said too, is you kind of have to, we've been doing this for a long time, and to see people build these programs, and you kind of have to do it with the goal in mind and work backwards, right? You start at the very end, the nirvana state, and then look, if it's a 3-year plan, it's a 3-year plan, but you have to work backwards from, okay, I want to be here, but I will tell you, and this isn't a prevalent thing, this is, look, audit, everything that you said is what we've seen. Start small, start with a fixed number of tier 1 vendors, right? It could be 100 or 200 at the beginning. And I know you might have 1,500. I know you might have 2,000 tier 1s, but figure out how to work it, grow it, scale it, automate it, lessons learned, and then build it. The folks that we see, and I'm just saying this, right, from the hundreds of folks, is and look, we had a lot of customers 3 or 4 years ago that they're like, I'm going to do 5,000. And they were unhappy, and because nobody's going to do 5,000 vendors in their first 6 months. You're lucky if you get through 50, quite frankly. It's build a program in a logical way and set realistic goals with a realistic number of vendors and scale it as you build competency. right? To me, that's the greatest thing, right? It's the don't, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It's that analogy. And I've been using that one for years here at this point. So.
And you're absolutely right. Build a program with the right framework, knowing very well what you need to do now and how it needs to grow and scale in the future. And often you have a lot of indicators to understand that, because right off the bat.
What are those indicators? How do you know how much your program needs this? Because look, we run into people in, there have been a few people that are like, I have 50 vendors. I just want to do 50 vendors. I never want to do more than 50 vendors. That's it. And then you have people who start, they're like, I got to do 5,000. You actually, you're like, no, you don't. Like, not in your first year, you don't, because you're going to, jump off a cliff. So what are the indicators to you for scale of the need for scale and growth and flexibility of a program?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it very fundamental, because I think fundamentals are important. So one is, make sure you have an inventory, right? So you need to know what's in front of you. And without an accurate inventory, there might be things that you think is important and things that just simply not in your inventory, that might be more important. So one thing is, do you have a central inventory of your vendors? That's a great start. That will at least tell you not only what your workbook might look like, but it will also tell you potential pipeline. And let me mention what I mean by pipeline. Pipeline is, think of pipeline as being a workbook. So if you do an inventory and you also define risk criteria for your inventory, hey, now that I have this inventory, what is risky to me? And let's assume that those two things are working as you expect. Now you would know, to your point, Mike, hey, if I want to focus on my top tier, because those are the riskiest one, you would know that because you have an inventory, you have a risk criteria. And not only that, let me kind of go back to pipeline. Now you would know, now that I've done the top and the most riskiest one, do we have the scalability? Do we have the bandwidth now to do more than that? And that's where your pipeline becomes an area that you want to focus on. How many of this can I do? Because that comes back to people, process, and technology. PPT never goes away. That becomes instrumental when you look at TPRM program. Do you have the right people? Do you have the right process? Do you have the right technology? But let's assume that, you built this framework, you have the inventory, you have the risk criteria. You start to understand not only what the volume looks like, you can start to forecast, hey, now that I've done 50, how many more do I have in my pipeline? And bear in mind, this is what you have currently in existence. Here are the ones that I've identified that currently in my inventory. You also have to anticipate, as part of your forecast, as part of your pipeline, what new vendors are going to be onboarded this year. And hopefully when you start looking at your inventory, it should be able to tell you that, right? Your inventory should be able to tell you how many did we added last year? How about the prior year? How about the year before that? What trends am I seeing when it comes to new vendors? And if you're looking at digital transformation and things of that nature, you should anticipate more.
Nasser, on that one, so I find, and this leads into this question that I'm going to get to asking in a second, but the vendor identification is probably the biggest challenge I've heard for third party. Like, you can't evaluate your third parties if you don't know who they are. And people are generally able to get some, but it's always a subset of the whole. And that's always the biggest struggle. Do you have a rule of thumb? Like, if you've been given 50 vendors, it's actually 100 vendors, or it's, do you know what I mean? Like where's the hidden skeleton there?
Yeah, what I usually say is that if you want to get a good litmus test of if your inventory is accurate or not, there'll be two things. One is understand who's paying the bills, because if you follow the payments, you kind of quickly start to enumerate
all the money, baby, all the money.
Exactly. You start to enumerate, who's getting paid, and hey, they might be vendors that should be in my portfolio. So that's one. The second thing is make sure you have a vendor definition, because I've seen portfolios that they throw everything in a portfolio, and because everything is thrown to the portfolio, is really hard sometimes to distinguish out of the 10,000, which are my top 50, right? Because they just didn't have a vendor definition, and anybody who they shook hands with became a vendor, and they threw it into their inventory. So I would say those two things, follow the money. Hey, who's getting paid? And that's where, your accounts payable, your procurement department, they are great partners, right? Because they start to give you that kind of insight, to give you the soundboard as, hey, how accurate is your inventory? And then secondly, make sure there's a definition, because you can have a very large organization and people might perceive vendors very differently from one business to another.
Yep. So let's say we've identified the vendors like we've been discussing for a few minutes. you're already theoretically close to capacity. So how do you effectively work in these new type of assessments?
Yeah. So to me, I'm going to go back to ABAC and ESG. These are risk disciplines that we need to further include as part of our due diligence, right? So again, we are very familiar with privacy, cyber, business continuity, and so forth. Those are the things that we have historically been doing. Again, if you have that framework in place, and I keep going back to people, process, technology, if you have that framework in place, to me, it is almost like you need to build a new wing in your home, or you want to extend or build a new room in your home, but you already have the foundation in place, right? You just can't build a new room in your home if you don't have the home. So it's that foundation. Do you have that framework in place so that I can, like a Lego block, can I pop in this new Lego without bringing down what I built with my Lego structure? So that is one. Do you have the framework in place? Also, since I'm talking about the framework, I keep going back to fundamentals. Do you have a central intake process? And does that central intake process defines or try to extrapolate the characteristics of that vendor, that engagement, so that what type of risks you need to go ahead and perhaps do a due diligence of, right? Because if you're now going to introduce ABAC and ESG, you don't want to do this for every single vendor. It just simply doesn't make sense. There should be appropriate risk criteria.
Yeah, you have to throttle it a little bit, right? Everybody should not be getting one of these.
Exactly. So part of your intake process, you should be able to get that type of metadata from your engagement and vendors to say, okay, this one is not qualified for ABAC and ESG, and it could be for good reasons, by the way. It could be that this is a vendor that's providing janitorial work. I'm just exaggerating to make a point, or providing cafeteria if you happen to be a cafeteria, if there happens to be a cafeteria in your building, as an example. But nonetheless, if you have the right data points that's being captured in the intake process and then being funneled downward to the appropriate stakeholders to do their due diligence, that becomes a tremendous plus, because all you're doing is taking advantage of an existing framework that you have proven that it works. And now when you add this, as long as the downstream stakeholders, and let's assume that this will continue to be compliant in handling ABAC and ESG, they will know that it's coming because you're helping them with their pipeline, you're helping them with their forecast. And if they are subscribing to third-party services for ABAC and ESG, that would just further enrich their due diligence, where they may not need to rely so much on the questionnaire and evidence collection, because they're getting really trustworthy sources coming in. But that's what I would propose, right? That yes, I totally agree that you could be drowning if you don't have a framework, if you don't have a cohesive system that's working synergistically and holistically across your organization. Because if these things are still done in silos, I think the person who suffers the most, believe it or not, is the business, who basically wants to onboard a vendor because there is either revenue to be generated, cost savings to take place, or something to improve customer experience. And that just gets further dragged out because these things are not interconnected. And now we're going to introduce 2 more steps in the process, which can be very frustrating.
So got a live question from Brian. I'm going to, what's the word? My brain is just, seriously, it's been home too much. I'm going to, I'm not going to read it verbatim. So anyways, but the question is, so you had mentioned procurement and compliance. Do they play a bigger role, a more of a partnership role? Like you're kind of in your security role, right? But talk about procurement and compliance relative to TPRM is one, and then does the role expand, for ESG, ABAC, and what you should do about it? Like, should you be, walking out with olive branches now, later, regardless of where you are in the process? So I think that's where we're trying to
get. So what I will tell you, and I kind of go back to that 360 view of risk. So when we look at a vendor can have multiple types of risk, right? From privacy to ESG. And I'm a strong believer that, there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. It's very comparable. It takes a lot of risk domains that are working in synergy to safely onboard a vendor, and ideally in a timely manner. So Procurement. Let me kind of put a pause there and just kind of focus on procurement. So procurement to me is a key stakeholder. I've seen organizations where it is procurement is running TPRM. So it is not the CISO anymore running the TPRM. It's not privacy or compliance. It's
Is that an ideal setup, in your opinion?
I like it for many reasons. One is, I see, I'm going to compare it to an octopus. You need a head that kind of makes sure that all the legs are interconnected in one form or another. So procurement can definitely be that head of the octopus and then push down the work, may it be compliance, privacy, business continuity to the legs from an analogy perspective, while the head knows exactly what's happening, what's the status of that work, what's bubbling up, and ultimately providing an overall risk posture of that vendor, right? Because when I do it from a cyber perspective, I'm going to do cyber risk. When I do it from a privacy perspective, I'm going to do privacy risk. But somebody needs to kind of aggregate that and say, hey, what does all these risks really constitute when it comes to an overall risk posture of this vendor? And I think that an entity like procurement can really play a key part in that. But like I said, I've seen procurement overseeing TPRM, but there's other organizations that structures that differently. I've also seen, if you work in a three line of defense in the financial industry, I've also seen where the second line sometimes would like to oversee TPRM, although to me it is all about a first line function when it comes to third party risk, and I'm sure second lines would agree. But anyway, what I would say is, as long as going back to procurement, they are a key stakeholder. I've used procurement also to help me, so when I am doing due diligence, as an example, and I'm helping my business in the vendor selection process. Usually procurement is in the front doing the RFIs, RFPs. So I usually take advantage of that. And I work very closely with procurement to say, hey, you know what? If we're talking about a vendor that is going to be handling regulated data, may that be HIPAA, GLIBA, PCI, you name it, GDPR, I would like you to have these factors in your RFIs and RFPs. Why? Because when they come back, I can quickly start helping as part of the vendor selection process. Because why do I need to add something to my pipeline if I can start to eliminate it way up front, right? What we call shifting left. What can I do way up front on the left side so that I don't necessarily have to do, because I have kind of evaluated and provided an opinion very early on. Or if it does come to my pipeline and I was involved in this RFP, I should now have some expectations, because the RFP would say, Mr. Vendor, Mrs. Vendor, you will do the following things with my data. They say, yep, we will do that. Yep, we will do that. When it comes to me for due diligence, that's an easy conversation with the vendor, right? Hey, when we did the RFP, you said you would do this, and we're expecting you to do this. Now show me the evidence, right? So that starts to really grease the skid line, so to speak, and help with the overall process. So I think that becomes really important. And then the last thing I would say about procurement is, and we talked about it, we might have touched upon it earlier, is, often procurement and legal work very closely. And I want to be involved in that relationship, because I want to make sure that contracts have appropriate terms and conditions. May that be ESG, terms and conditions, privacy, cyber,
Preaching to the choir, man. If you got to get your stuff in there so you can actually affect change. And that's where the rubber meets the road, baby.
Exactly. So you're right. So, so the contract plays a really big part, because, what people sometimes don't realize is that when you do your due diligence, and I do emphasize the word when, because you may only be able to do it once a year for your critical vendors, or you're in a position where you only do it once because you just don't have the capability or bandwidth to even revisit a vendor. So it may just be once, but that contract lives in that relationship for the duration of that contract. So you want to make sure that you have appropriate terms and conditions, including controls in those terms in those contracts, so that when you're not able to go and verify and do your assessment, that the contract is still enforced, right? So procurement plays a really big part. Compliance plays a big part. We talked about, in places that I've seen ESG and ABAC, if they're not completely their own divisions in that organization, sometimes they fall under compliance. And compliance is a key partner. They know more about regulations that are having to do with ABAC than anyone else. They are the subject matter experts. They've been doing this in their organization for the longest time. They know when something smells good, smells bad. So you take advantage of those skill sets.
So, question on the screen. So, look, everybody, the net result of this is everybody's always looking to, you have to report something, right? I have X amount of vendors, we've done this, I have X good, X bad, or there has to be some metric that validates the effort. Does ESG change the reporting in any way, shape, or form, or should it roll into standard?
That's a good question. I would tell you that first, it should be incorporated into your metrics, and where necessarily called out uniquely in your metrics. Because like I mentioned, ESG is again, a lot of board visibility. So the boards may want to know particularly, hey, you know what, when we talk about our critical vendors, are any of these putting our company in harm's way when it comes to their ESG practices? And that's something that I would anticipate, if not already happening with board members, just because of the attention of ESG. But I would also add that, you may already have metrics in place that talks about performance, that talks about risk, what we like to call KPIs and KRIs. And also important when we talk about metrics, who are you presenting these metrics to? Right?
And by the way, do you have 2 or 3 KPI that are like, these are my go-tos relevant for just for the program, whether they apply to ESG?
Yeah. So the ones that I like to, it's kind of high level. So, because typically this is what execs and boards want to know is, hey, tell me which critical or high risk vendors are not financially stable. Because a vendor that's not financially stable can impact an organization in a multitude of ways, right? If you don't have the money, if you don't have the revenue, if you don't have the cash stream that you need to operationally effectively run a business, everything gets downgraded. Your cybersecurity is not going to be well funded. Your privacy is not going to be well funded. Business continuity may be in jeopardy and so forth. So, financial stability is really, really an underpinning risk. So I would always look at, hey, which of my high risk vendors are not financially stable? Because I don't anticipate that, but it's a big red flag. Right. The other one would be, which of my high and critical vendors, and again, I'm taking a risk-based approach, right? Which of my critical and high-risk vendors have experienced a material data breach or security incident in the past 6 months, in the past year? And that's because we know that ransomware is everywhere, but we do know that security incidents have not stopped. They continue. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So as board members and executives, they want to know, what is it about a material, and I do mean a material data breach. I don't mean, hey, we had one customer record that got leaked. I'm talking about, a significant number of customer records that now your company is interacting with the media. There might be class action lawsuits. These are the things that the boards are really want to be in tune with. And then the other one that I would just throw in there, if you are paying for a vendor to provide you services, products, you want to make sure that, SLAs are not being violated. So usually when it comes to critical and high-risk vendor, are my vendors performing as we expect? Because they are an extension of our business. If any of our businesses are failing to meet our customer demands, if any of our businesses are failing to meet our expectations, that's a concern. So that's no different than with vendors. So I always throw in there, failing to meet, SLAs month after month, or any material outage. They couldn't produce this outcome on the month of March and the month of April. What are the impacts? The call center went down, that was outsourced. They couldn't handle a customer call for the past 2 hours. Those things are really concerning, something that board members, executive needs to know. And then if you want to throw in other metrics, operationally speaking, about your TPRM program, you should say, hey, you know what? Now that we have this program in place and we're trying to identify all high-risk vendor, we have seen 5 vendors that have gone through the system and never done a due diligence. They have a contract in place and they just kind of bypass the system. Not that you're trying to get anyone in trouble, but these are risk indicators, operationally speaking, internally, that your board needs to know, because you may not have everybody who wants to, quote unquote, cooperate the way you like to, right? So those are the things that I think board members are interested in, as well as execs. And again, pay attention to the metrics that they already collect. If you have the opportunity to take a look at the metrics that your execs and board collect, you can take advantage of that and understand some of the themes that they get concerned with.
Yeah, don't recreate the wheel, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely. They might be concerned with reputation or regulatory or compliance or lawsuits and things of that nature. Lend your metrics to those so that you're speaking a common language, because to them, they understand the risk at a very business and corporate level. And if we can tie our metrics with that, you hit a home run.
So can you track this stuff in spreadsheets? Can you do, that's funny, you laugh.
Well, here's what I'd say. Let me start with some assumptions, and I laugh in no way to trivialize those of us, including myself, that have and may still be doing spreadsheets. So in no shape or form am I trivialize that effort, because it's still valiant effort for you to do what you need to do on behalf of your company to identify risk associated.
Yeah, I'm not blaming the people. Everybody's doing the best with what they can. First, there's no against the people that have been asked to do it in this way. That being said,
right, absolutely. Yeah, so let me give you some assumptions, and then from those assumptions, I think we can talk about, what are the material risks, right? So one, spreadsheets relies on emails, and we know how effective email is, right? Not only that, you are assuming that when you send an email that the recipient party who needs to complete that spreadsheet received it. God knows if the email controls just killed it before it went in, or it went to a junk box, and you're also assuming that you received that spreadsheet by email in a timely manner, and then presuming that all this is done through email, because that's what happens with spreadsheets. As an example, that your email system, someone is vigilantly looking at to make sure that when they get the questionnaire back in the spreadsheet format, that they can quickly process it, right? And that sounds, hey, that sounds doable, but what happened when people go on vacation? What happened when people get ill? And they're not looking at their emails, for argument's sake. So it can become a struggle just on those assumptions, right? And I just want to stop there on the assumption piece. Now let's kind of go into the material impact. So, to me, one of the challenges with spreadsheet is that it's really, really hard to stick to a specified SLA. So if you, as a due diligence stakeholders in your organization, you say, hey, you know what, we will do the due diligence within X number of days, whatever you want to call that SLA. It's really hard when you're relying on emails and spreadsheets to begin with. And because you are going to impact the turnaround time or not being able to meet your SLAs, because the capability now doesn't lend itself to that, you're going to impact go-to-market, right? So when the business wants to come in and sign that contract for very, very good reasons, and they want, what we like to call go-to-market, it's going to be hard to be an enabler of that. And just because of the nature of spreadsheet, right? I think the other challenge with spreadsheet is they're always suspect to audits, right? There hasn't been a place that I haven't worked at, or peers that I've spoken to that they're using spreadsheet that don't have an audit issue in one time or another because of the manual process. How do you know that the spreadsheet from the email was captured, placed in the right file directory? How do you know that somebody did not overlook a spreadsheet that is still in his or her email, right? So it just becomes very prone to audit issues. It does introduce a lot of operational deficiencies. And again, just because of email and spreadsheets, right? You send out an email, where's the tickler? How do you know when you're supposed to get it back? And then what happens when you don't get it back? Is there a tickler that tells you, hey, remind this person, and by another email, please send that back, and so forth. So it does introduce a lot of administrative overhead that, to me, has no value in the effectiveness of the process, right? On how you do your due diligence. And then the last challenge, and there's more, right? But the last challenge I would say is, if someone were to ask you, can you tell me what are the most common risks that you have seen in the vendor portfolio? You probably have to go to X number of spreadsheets and open them up and extrapolate what you think are the most common risks. And even if you extrapolate from your spreadsheets risk and put them into a central issue management system, the question one would ask is, hey, did you extrapolate every single risk that you identify in the spreadsheet into the issue management system? Right. Or might you have overlooked one, two, or more of those risks? And I've seen that happen personally in my organization with me, as a matter of fact, where you think that, hey, I've taken a spreadsheet, I've reviewed, these are the gaps, these are the concerns, I'm going to identify these as the 3 risks. A month goes by, 2 months go by, audit knocks on my door. Hey, Nasser, we are really concerned about this vendor. We want to take a look at this vendor, show us what we did. Wait a minute. I noticed that in the spreadsheet, you identified 3 risks, but you only moved 2 of them into the issue management system. Hence, you overlook 1 risk. Here's an audit issue, right? So it's just a challenge overall, that spreadsheet, the challenge that comes with spreadsheets.
So you had mentioned this before about the financial and reputational monitoring, and while I don't know, that kind of sits in between. It's not exactly third-party security controls, but it's not ABAC. So I mean, the question, how important is it? And you had mentioned during our prep call, right, about offboarding too. So let's tackle those too.
Yeah, so let's talk about, remember I talked about, financial risk to me is
Yeah, that's number one. That was number one for, that was a top tier, top issue. So
yeah, I think that's an underpinning risk, right? If a company is not financially stable, everything that company does goes into question, including their security posture, how good they are with privacy. And I'm not knocking companies in any which way that are in financially troubled. All I'm trying to tell you is that that's a key indicator. If you are not financially sound, there's a key indicator. Other things that are important, such as cyber, ESG, and so forth, may not be where they need to be. So that's one. Reputational monitoring, I think it's very important because there are a lot of things that happens between your first assessment and your next assessment that sometimes you just don't have the visibility. But if you know that, hey, there is something out there that's happening, and I'm getting that heartbeat alert, for lack of a better word, I'm getting that update information regarding a critical vendor of mine that I want to be abreast of what's happening between the time I do the first due diligence and then the ensuing due diligence, which may happen 6 months, a year from now, whatever that cadence might be. You definitely want to have, excuse me.
Hold on, get a drink. You get a drink, and I'm gonna just let everybody know. We're gonna do these 2 questions. Then if we have any more questions, but I promise to get everybody out of here like 3 of the top of the hour, so everybody can stay on schedule, go to the bathroom, get another drink, and then get to your next Zoom meeting. So we'll try to keep everybody on track here and ask any questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the drink.
Yeah, no worries.
But so we were talking about financial. Now, the reputation, like I said, you definitely want to be kept apprised of what's happening reputationally with your vendors, which can impact your reputation, by the way. And if you subscribe and you feel that that's worthy, and often the case, you have to make sense of what you're subscribing to, right? Because it's all about, how relevant is this to me, and is this meaningful, and can I take decisive actions based on what I'm saying? So that's part of understanding who you're subscribing to when it comes to reputational monitoring. But I think it is relevant, and I also think that often the case, and I'm giving you a worst case scenario to kind of make a point. When you're can talk today, if one of your top tier vendors, one of your critical vendors, winds up in the news in a very, very negative way, very often, the minute that your executive, your management, your board members know of it, it trickles down pretty quick. So, if you can be ahead of that, if you can somehow understand, hey, I see from what I'm subscribing to from a reputation monitoring perspective that this vendor is just degrading, and let me go and have these conversations with this vendor. And those conversations are solidifying the data points that you're collecting, the data points you're subscribing to. You can start to now talk to the businesses, to your execs.
So while we're on the subject, I got a question from Jeff F. What tools are you using to evaluate financial risk?
I'm going to keep it vendor agnostic because I don't want to come across as if I'm supporting any particular vendor out there. But if you wanted to, you can actually Google. There's companies out there. There's an easy dozen out there that would provide you financial information. And let me kind of help you with some qualifications here. Usually when we seek financial information, public companies have to provide their financial statements. That's because they're a public company and they have requirements. So with those are usually very accessible. And yes, you can still use a vendor to help you aggregate that data and present it to you in a very meaningful way, because one of the challenges with financial reporting is that somebody has to understand what that reporting is saying, right? Because I'm very familiar with cyber, privacy, compliance, business continuity, but I'm not really a proficient expert when it comes to reviewing financial reports. There has to be somebody who knows that. And that's one of the reasons sometimes you will subscribe to a financial entity, a financial vendor that gives you that information so that you don't have to do all that footwork. But going back to public companies, usually that data is readily available. I think where it becomes a challenge is with private companies. Private companies are not obligated to provide financial statements. And usually what I've seen with private companies is that when you first are looking to sign a contract with them, they'll provide you what you're asking for, because that's just good business. But the minute the contract is signed, you may not get another financial report, by the way. So important to think about that from a contractual perspective, right? What is it in the contract that I should be including so that I get these financial reports on an ongoing basis or upon request from my vendors? However, going back to some of these vendors that provide financial information on public, they also do on private. So they have the capability to also do this because either they're already collecting it from the private entities, or on your behalf, they would work with those private vendors to get that information. So I'll leave it there if you don't mind, because I just don't want to advocate any vendors, but there are a handful out there that will literally provide you financial status. You know, the one that, there's many out there that provide you financial status of a company that you're looking to do business with.
Yep. And look, I'll tell you, that's a feed that we have in the product too, but if you're interested, great. If not, no worries, but just put it out there. So Nasser, let's come all the way back around to, Amanda has one more poll question. Thank God you texted me. I was going to just wrap this thing up. You should have just cut me off too. Amanda has another poll question. Go, Amanda.
Thank you. Just been waiting this whole time here. Yeah, I hate to break it up, but just wanted to throw in one more poll question. You know, since you got a lot of information from everybody here today, was there an incentive that brought you here? Do you guys have something going on from a third-party risk standpoint for 2021 that we can potentially help you with? So,
And I would say ESG and ABAC too.
yeah, that too.
Probably should have thought of that. That my fault, but probably should have
Yeah,
thought
we'll blame it on you.
That would be a yes under that.
Perfect. Yeah, that as well. If you're looking to talk about, yeah, those two acronyms, those are hot topics.
We got to figure out the ES and G, right? Because Nasser had the ampersand and we weren't using that. So
I know.
Maybe we should get the ampersand. Right?
No, let me tell you, man, I might be bad about that one. I may be bad because I know people say ES and G. I happen to just by default throw in the N in there because it just sounds better to my ears.
Yeah, it sounds good phonetically. I think I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So Nasser, while the poll question's up there, ESG, ABAC, like real important, like where is it, like key takeaway for folks, and when if they have one or two key things about this from this.
Yeah. So ESG, definitely important, getting a tremendous amount of attention from the White House, regulators. If you have a geographical footprint all over the EU, ESG is significant. They already have regulations, if not soon to come out. So one, very important. And I also mentioned this definitely is a board agenda. So boards are zoning into this. No different than ABAC. ABAC is also very important. The second thing is, you know, if you're going to continue and further bolster the types of risks you're going to be looking at in your organization, and you're going to look at ESG and ABAC, I think it's also important to understand how does your organization do these two things, and then how do they want to extend those capabilities from people, process, and technology, right? They may have the people with the skill sets. They really know how to ask the questions and review the right content here. So it would be, you know, do you have these programs in place? And I'm positive with ABAC is in place, ESG is in place in one form or another. It's just what maturity level you happen to be in. If they're in place, you know, how do you work with those parts of your organization to start to extend it to your third-party portfolio? Because if you just extend it without having any catchers and you're just pitching out there, the minute your vendors turn around and give you what you're looking for, you still need somebody to kind of say, okay, can I make sense of this? Is this good? Is this bad? And this is why it's an internal thing that starts to propagate externally to your vendor.
Fair enough.
I have
Thank
a
you, my friend.
question.
Amanda, back to you.
Yeah, just really quick, because I had someone come and approach me about regarding FERC and NERC, and I was curious as to, NERC and FERC. Is there one that's better than the other? Is there, like, this is kind of new for me personally too. So what's the difference between the two? Is one better than the other? And do you need both? Like, what? I don't really know much about that.
Yeah, you know, what I would say is they both are relevant. I think what's really important is to understand from an organization perspective, you know, which of those are ones that an organization needs to align with. Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one, but I think it's an organization decision. This is, to me, this is very comparable to when you look at cybersecurity frameworks, you know, like the NIST and ISO.
I was going to say NIST, NIST 853,
yeah,
and NIST
exactly. And often companies who subscribe to a hybrid, right? US companies like this, but the minute you go geographically and you operate in different continents, you see that ISO is just as big.
It's ISO or GDPR or something, right?
Yeah,
It's
and there's a million of those. So
Yeah.
I guess
So-
the more this grows, it'll probably even
look,
have
I
more.
will tell you, look, Nasser, and I really do want to wrap up, but I will tell you guys that focus on the outcomes that Nasser talked about, not necessarily on like all the frameworks are good if your goals are set correctly, right? They're flavors of the same. I call it the pizza conversation. There's no bad pizza. There's all good different kinds of pizza. So focus on the security and the outcomes and all the kind of the things that Nasser spoke about today. I don't think you can go wrong if you had followed any one of 20 of these, but it's how you implement and how your organization approaches a problem to begin with, would be my advice in 20 years.
I agree with that as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nasser. And this is super insightful. I took probably 2 pages of notes in Word while you guys were both talking around. So thank you again, Mike. Always a pleasure to see you.
Always a pleasure.
And this will be in your inbox tomorrow if you're sticking with us. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much again. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Take care.
guys. Thanks,
Bye.
Nasser.